Welcome to America's worst road trip. Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of American history's most infamous disasters, the Donner Party. So go ahead and get comfortable, maybe grab some water, definitely turn down those lights. We're gonna be here for a while, wandering through the snow-covered Sierra Nevada mountains with a group of pioneers who made some truly spectacular mistakes. And when I say mistakes, I mean the kind that textbooks still can't quite look directly at. This is the story of families who just wanted to go to California and start fresh. You know, the classic American dream. New land, new opportunities, maybe some gold eventually. Instead, they got trapped in the mountains during one of the worst winters on record, ran out of food and, well, we'll get there. Slowly, like they did. The Donner Party has become this almost mythical tale of survival and cannibalism whispered about in history classes and referenced in dark jokes about Thanksgiving. But the real story is so much weirder and sadder than the legend suggests. It's about bad timing, worse decisions, wounded pride, and the cruel randomness of survival. It's about how quickly civilization can peel away when you're hungry enough, cold enough, desperate enough. So, settle in. We're going back to 1846, when a group of about 90 men, women, and children left Springfield, Illinois, heading west on the California Trail. Most of them would make it to California eventually, but not all of them. And those who did would carry the weight of what happened in those mountains for the rest of their lives. Let's start at the beginning, before the snow, before the hunger, back when this was still just an adventure. The whole thing kicked off in the spring of 1846. America was in the middle of its massive westward expansion phase, manifest destiny and all that jingoistic enthusiasm for claiming land that, already had people living on it. But the settlers heading west didn't think about that too much. They thought about fertile valleys in California, mild weather, opportunity. The Oregon Trail was well established by this point, and thousands of families were making the trek every year. Our story centers on two families initially, the Donners and the Reeds. George Donner was 62 years old, which was pretty ancient for frontier travel, honestly. He was a prosperous farmer from Illinois, and he was heading this expedition along with his brother Jacob Donner, age 65, because apparently being in your 60s in 1846 wasn't enough of a challenge without also attempting to cross the entire continent in covered wagons. George Donner had married his third wife, Tamsin, who was actually educated and cultured, a former schoolteacher, which was unusual for the time. She was 44 and brought 3 daughters from George's previous marriage, Elitha, Leanna, and Frances. George and Tamsin also had 3 young daughters together, Eliza, Georgia, and Frances. So the Donner portion of this party was already quite the extended family situation. Then there were the Reeds. James Fraser Reed was 35, originally from Ireland, and he'd made good money in the furniture business. He was traveling with his wife Margaret and her mother, Sarah Keyes, who was 70 and in poor health. Already you can see the problem forming, bringing a 70-year-old woman on a 6-month wagon journey across untamed wilderness. But sure, what could go wrong? The children were Virginia, 12 years old, who would later become one of the most important sources for what happened, Patty, 8, James Jr., 5, and Thomas, 3. The family also brought along several hired workers and a servant named Eliza Williams, who was a 25-year-old mixed-race woman. The presence of servants and hired help tells you something about the Reeds' social status. They weren't poor farmers scratching together enough to start over. They were relatively wealthy people looking for even better opportunities. And James Reed, well, he had a bit of an ego. He'd designed this massive custom wagon that everyone called the Pioneer Palace Car. It was enormous, basically a 2-story mobile home with actual beds, a stove, and a side entrance with steps. It was pulled by 8 oxen and was, by all accounts, completely impractical for the journey ahead. But it was impressive. Reed wanted everyone to know he was doing well. These families, along with several other smaller groups and individual travelers, formed the core of what would become the Donner Party. Though, at the start in April 1946, they were just part of a much larger wagon train heading west. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. They were following the established route, making decent time and probably feeling pretty good about their decision to uproot their entire lives and head into the unknown. The first sign of trouble, and oh boy was it a sign, came in the form of a book. Lansford Hastings was a lawyer and an opportunist who had been to California and decided he was now an expert on getting there. In 1845, he published The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, which included descriptions of a shortcut he claimed would save travelers considerable time. This route, which became known as the Hastings Cutoff, would supposedly shave weeks off the journey by bypassing the established trail and going more directly through the Wasatch Mountains and across the Great Salt Lake Desert. Now, here's the thing about the Hastings Cutoff. Hastings himself had never actually taken wagons on this route. He'd traveled at once on horseback going east to west and decided that surely it would work great for families with heavy wagons and livestock. The confidence of mediocre men truly knows no bounds. But the book sounded good. It sounded scientific and authoritative. And more importantly, it promised something that appealed to everyone, a faster route. Time was precious on these journeys. You wanted to reach California before winter set in. The mountain passes in the Sierra Nevada were treacherous in good weather and completely impassable once the snow started. Everyone knew this. Getting there faster meant getting there safer. James Reed was particularly taken with this idea. Remember, Reed was a proud man, a successful businessman, someone who trusted his own judgment and liked being ahead of the curve. When the wagon train reached Fort Laramie in what's now Wyoming, Reed received a letter from Hastings himself, encouraging travelers to take the new route. The letter made it sound like a sure thing, a tested path that would save everyone trouble. At Fort Laramie, the main wagon train prepared to continue on the established California Trail. But Reed and George Donner talked it over with some of the other families, and they made a decision. They would split off and take the Hastings Cutoff. It would be faster, it would be better. What could possibly go wrong with abandoning a well-established trail to follow the advice of a guy who'd never actually taken wagons through the route he was recommending? So on July 20th, 1846, at a place called Little Sandy River in what's now Wyoming, the group that would become known as the Donner Party made their fateful choice. They said goodbye to the main wagon train, which would continue on the proven route, and they turned southwest, toward the Hastings Cutoff, toward the Great Salt Lake Desert, toward a series of delays and disasters that would seal their fate before they even saw the Sierra Nevada. There were about 87 people at this point, though the exact number is hard to pin down because people were joining and leaving wagon trains constantly. But let's say roughly 90 souls, convinced they were making the smart choice, the efficient choice, taking control of their own destiny by finding a better way. They had no idea they'd just made the decision that would doom them. The group elected George Donner as their captain, which made sense. He was older, respected, prosperous, and seemed like steady leadership. James Reed was also influential, but Donner got the official title. They were optimistic. The weather was good, the wagons were packed with supplies, the oxen were strong, everything was fine. They reached Fort Bridger in late July, a trading post run by the famous mountain man Jim Bridger. And here's where things get a little suspicious in retrospect. Bridger and his partner, Louis Vasquez, both encouraged the Donner Party to take the Hastings Cutoff. They said it was a fine route, no problems at all, very passable. Now, some historians believe that Bridger and Vasquez had financial incentives to promote the Hastings route. It would bring more traffic past their trading post, after all. The established California Trail bypassed Fort Bridger entirely. So maybe, just maybe, these guys were talking up a route they knew wasn't actually that great, because it was good for business. Capitalism ruins everything, even in 1846. The Donner Party stocked up on supplies at Fort Bridger and continued on. They were following Hastings trail markers now, looking for the signs that would lead them through the shortcut. But here's the problem. Hastings himself had just left Fort Bridger a few weeks earlier, leading another wagon train through his cutoff route. And he was having problems. Big problems. The route was way more difficult than he described in his book, shocking absolutely no one with any sense. But the Donner Party didn't know this yet. They just knew they were a bit behind Hastings, following his trail, expecting to catch up with him at some point for guidance. They reached the Weber Canyon entrance to the Wasatch Mountains on August 6th, and here they found something troubling: a note from Hastings stuck to a board. The note said that the route through Weber Canyon was very difficult and that wagon trains should wait for him to return and guide them through an alternate route. So they waited and sent messengers ahead to try to find Hastings and bring him back. Days passed. This was already eating into their schedule, burning through the time that the shortcut was supposed to save them. Finally, some of the men caught up with Hastings, who was struggling to get his own wagon train through an alternate route that was proving to be a complete nightmare. Hastings refused to come back and guide the Donner Party personally, but he rode back part of the way and vaguely pointed out the direction they should go. Thanks for nothing, Lansford. What followed was nearly a month of absolute hell cutting their way through the Wasatch Mountains. This wasn't a trail. This wasn't even a path. This was thick brush, steep canyons, and dense forest where they literally had to cut their own road with axes and saws. The men worked themselves to exhaustion, chopping through trees, moving boulders, creating a passable route inch by painful inch. Women and children waited in camps, supplies dwindling, watching the calendar pages turn while they sat in canyons that should have taken a few days to cross. The journey through the Wasatch Mountains, which Hastings had made sound like a minor inconvenience, took them nearly 3 weeks of brutal labor. They finally emerged from the mountains on August 27th, exhausted, behind schedule, and already starting to bicker and blame each other for the decision to take this cursed shortcut. But the worst was still ahead of them. Next came the Great Salt Lake Desert. Hastings had described this as an easy 2-day crossing with plenty of water and grass. In reality, it was 80 miles of barren, sun-scorched wasteland with no water, no grass, and no shade, just blinding white salt flats stretching in every direction, shimmering with heat, dotted with the bones and abandoned wagons of previous travelers who'd learned the hard way that Hastings was, to put it mildly, full of shit. The desert that breaks everything. The Donner Party began crossing the Great Salt Lake Desert on September 2nd. They traveled at night when it was cooler, trying to save the oxen from the worst of the heat. But there was no good way to do this crossing. It was just suffering, mile after mile of it. The oxen began to break down. These were massive animals, incredibly strong, but they needed water and they needed food. The salt desert offered neither. Animals started to weaken, to stagger, to collapse. Some died in their yokes. Others, driven mad by thirst, broke free and ran off into the desert, never to be seen again. Wagons had to be abandoned when there weren't enough animals left to pull them. Families had to make desperate choices about what to keep and what to leave behind in the salt. Furniture, tools, keepsakes, supplies, anything heavy got dumped in hopes that lightening the load would save the remaining oxen. James Reed's ridiculous Pioneer Palace car had to be abandoned. The massive 2-story wagon that had been such a source of pride at the beginning of the journey was left in the desert, its pretensions literally dissolving in the salt. The Reed family consolidated into a simpler wagon. Humility comes for us all eventually. The crossing took 6 days instead of the promised 2. When they finally reached the other side, reaching water and grass at the foot of the Pilot Range Mountains, they'd lost dozens of oxen and had to leave behind several wagons. The survivors were exhausted, traumatized, and rapidly running through their supplies. They had started this shortcut with enough provisions for the journey and some extra, but all these delays meant they were eating through food faster than anticipated, and they'd lost wagons full of supplies in the desert. The math was starting to look bad. It was now early September. They were way behind schedule. The established California trail that they'd abandoned back in July, that route would have gotten them to the Sierra Nevada by now, probably already crossing into California. But the Donner Party was still in what's now Nevada, facing more desert travel, and winter was coming. Tempers were fraying. People were exhausted and scared and looking for someone to blame. And increasingly, they blamed James Reed, who had been one of the loudest advocates for taking the shortcut. On October 5th, everything came to a head. They were traveling near the Humboldt River, still nowhere near the mountains, when a wagon driven by the Reed family teamster got tangled with a wagon driven by a teamster for the Graves family. The two teamsters got into an argument that turned into a fight. John Snyder, the Graves teamster, started beating Reed's teamster with a whip handle. James Reed rushed over to intervene. His wife Margaret also tried to step between the men. Snyder, who was apparently in a full rage, hit Margaret in the head with the whip handle, and Reed, seeing his wife injured, pulled out a knife and stabbed John Snyder in the chest. Snyder died within minutes, bleeding out on the side of the trail while everyone watched in shock and horror. This was a disaster. Snyder had been well-liked, a strong worker, someone people respected. Reed was already unpopular because of the shortcut decision and his wealthy guy attitude. Now he'd killed someone. The party debated what to do. Some wanted to hang Reed immediately. Others argued for banishment. George Donner tried to keep things calm, but he was dealing with a group of frightened, exhausted people who needed someone to punish for how wrong everything had gone. They eventually decided on exile. Reed would be banished from the party, sent ahead without a wagon or most supplies. He could take a horse and try to reach California on his own, but he couldn't travel with the group anymore. His wife and children would continue with the wagons under the protection of the other families. So, James Reed rode off alone into the wilderness, leaving his family behind, carrying the weight of a man's death and his own spectacular fall from prominence, from wealthy patriarch with a palace wagon to exile on horseback. Quite the character arc. The party continued on. They were still following the standard California trail route now, having finally left the cursed Hastings Cutoff behind. But they lost so much time. It was mid-October. The Sierra Nevada was ahead, and every day was getting colder. On October 13th, they reached the Truckee River, named after a northern Paiute guide who had helped earlier parties. This river would lead them up into the mountains, toward the pass they needed to cross to reach California. They were close now, so close. But they were also completely exhausted. The oxen were worn down to nothing. The people were tired and hungry and scared, and the weather was turning. On October 20th, more disaster struck. They woke up to find that Paiute raiders had attacked during the night, stealing or killing several oxen and horses. The party was running on fumes already, and now they'd lost even more of their precious draft animals. Some wagons would have to be abandoned. Some families would have to combine their remaining resources and travel together or not at all. They were near a place now called the Truckee Meadows, not far from where Reno, Nevada stands today. They rested for a few days, trying to recover, trying to prepare for the final push over the mountains. But they'd lost so much time. It was late October. In the Sierra Nevada, that meant one thing: snow could start any day. On October 25th, they left the meadows and began climbing toward the pass. The trail followed the river up into the mountains, getting steeper, rockier, colder. They could see snow on the peaks above them. The pass they needed to cross was up there, waiting. On October 28th, they reached what's now called Donner Lake, a beautiful alpine lake sitting at about 6,000 feet elevation. The pass they needed to cross, now called Donner Pass, was visible above them, another 1,000 feet of elevation gain. It didn't look that far, maybe 3 miles up to the top. They made camp by the lake. They'd attempt the pass in the morning, get everyone over, and then it would be a straight shot down to California's Central Valley. They were so close, just one more push. On October 31st, they woke to light snow falling. Not a lot, just a dusting, but enough to make everyone nervous. They hitched up the wagons and started up the trail toward the pass. The first wagons made it about halfway up before the trail became impassable. The snow was deeper than it looked, and it was actively snowing now, coming down harder. The oxen couldn't get traction. The wagons kept sliding backward. After hours of struggling, they had to admit defeat and turn back to the lake. They'd try again tomorrow. It was just a freak early snow. It would clear. They'd get over. But that night, it snowed harder, and the next day, and the next. Within a week, there were 5 feet of snow on the ground, and it was still coming down. The pass, so close, so tantalizingly close, was now completely blocked. No wagon was getting through that. No ox could pull through that. Maybe a person on foot could try, but it would be incredibly dangerous. And even if they made it over, then what? They'd be alone in the mountains without supplies. The Donner Party was trapped. 81 people, including dozens of children, stuck on the wrong side of the Sierra Nevada with winter settling in like a heavy blanket, cutting off all escape routes. They had some supplies left, but not enough to last months. They had shelter, some of them found an abandoned cabin by the lake left by previous travelers, and they quickly built more crude shelters and lean-tos. But they were trapped, and the snow kept falling and falling and falling. November 1846 would be remembered as the beginning of one of the worst winters in Sierra Nevada history. The snow would eventually reach 20 feet deep in places. The passes would remain closed for months, and the people trapped by the lake, along with another group trapped a few miles back along the trail, would have to figure out how to survive with dwindling food and no way out. Now, let's talk about the geography here because it matters for understanding what happened. The main group, around 60 people, were camped by what's now Donner Lake. They'd built rough cabins and shelters using the abandoned cabin as a base and adding structures nearby. This site became known as Donner Lake Camp, or the Murphy Cabin site, after one of the families there. But not everyone had made it that far. The Donner brothers, George and Jacob, along with their families and some teamsters, had broken an axle on one of their wagons a few miles back down the trail. They'd stopped to make repairs, planning to catch up with the others. But then the snow came, and they were trapped at their repair site, about 5 or 6 miles from the lake. So you had two separate camps, the larger group at the lake and the Donner family camp back down the trail. Both groups were trapped, but they were separated by miles of snow-covered trail. Communication between the camps would become difficult and eventually almost impossible. At first, everyone thought this was temporary, just bad luck with an early snow. It would clear in a few days, maybe a week, and they'd be able to continue. They rationed their remaining food carefully. They killed some of the remaining oxen for meat. They waited. But the snow didn't stop. The storms kept rolling in off the Pacific, dumping more and more snow on the mountains. Days turned into weeks. November turned into December. And slowly, horribly, it became clear that they weren't getting out until spring. The food situation became critical. They'd started with limited supplies after all the losses in the desert and on the trail. Now they were trying to stretch maybe a month's worth of food across 4 or 5 months of winter. The math didn't work. They ate the remaining oxen, then they ate the horses, then the mules, then the dogs. People started boiling bones to make a weak broth. They ate leather from boots and harnesses after boiling it soft enough to chew. They ate bark. They ate anything they could find that might provide calories. Children cried from hunger. Adults grew weak and listless. The cold was relentless. The snow kept falling and the shelters were barely adequate. People started getting sick. Scurvy, exposure, malnutrition. Bodies were shutting down from the combined stress of cold and starvation. The Snowshoe Party and the first deaths. In mid-December, a group of 15 people decided they had to try to escape and get help. They couldn't just sit there waiting to die. Someone had to make it over the pass and reach the settlements in California's Central Valley, bring back a rescue party with food and supplies. They called themselves the Forlorn Hope, which honestly is just perfectly bleak. These 15, 10 men and 5 women, fashioned crude snowshoes out of oxenhide and wood strips. None of them had ever used snowshoes before. Most of them were already weakened from hunger, but they had to try. On December 16th, the Forlorn Hope set out from the lake camp. They took minimal supplies because they couldn't carry much: some meat, some coffee, a few blankets. They figured they could cross the pass in a day, reach the California side in another day or two, and be in the settlements within a week. It was 33 miles to the nearest ranch in the Sacramento Valley. Surely they could cover 33 miles in a week, even in the snow. The group included Charles Stanton, a bachelor who had actually made it to California earlier and come back with supplies, and 2 Miwok guides named Salvador and Luis. Stanton had been a hero for returning when he could have stayed safe in California. Now he was gambling his life again trying to save everyone. Also in the group were Mary Ann Graves, Sarah Fosdick, Sarah Foster, Harriet Pike, and Amanda McCutcheon, all young women in their 20s who were strong and determined. The men included Patrick Dolan, Franklin Graves, Jay Fosdick, Charles Berger, Lemuel Murphy, William Foster, Antonio, and William Eddy. They climbed toward the pass, struggling through the deep snow even with the snowshoes. The snow was powdery and soft in places, hard and icy in others. The snowshoes kept breaking, people kept falling, but they made it to the pass that first day and started down the western slope. And then they got lost. The trail was completely buried under snow. The landmarks were gone. Everything looked the same, just endless white forest and snow and more snow. They wandered, trying to find the trail, trying to navigate by the stars when the clouds cleared enough to see them. But they kept going in circles, exhausting themselves, burning through their meager supplies. Charles Stanton, who'd been snowblind and struggling, couldn't keep going. He sat down by a fire they'd built and told the others to go ahead. He'd catch up. They left him there, and he froze to death. The man who'd risked everything to bring supplies back to the trapped party, the hero who didn't have to be there at all, died alone in the snow. The group pressed on. They were lost, starving, freezing. They ran out of food. They killed nothing, found nothing. On Christmas Eve, a massive storm hit, pinning them down for days. They huddled together, trying not to freeze as the snow piled up around them. On Christmas Day, 1846, they were trapped in a snow shelter they'd dug, with no food, no way forward, and no way back. Patrick Dolan started exhibiting signs of hypothermia-induced delirium. He became violent, raving, trying to wander off into the storm. The others had to restrain him. He died that night. Then Antonio died. Then Franklin Graves. Then Patrick Dolan's body, and then the others, started to freeze solid in the snow. And the survivors, after days without food, faces drawn with starvation, made the decision that would define the Donner Party story forever. They ate the dead. They didn't talk about it directly, they didn't make a big announcement, but when someone quietly started cutting flesh from the frozen bodies, no one stopped them. They were going to die if they didn't eat, so they ate. They made a pact. No one would eat their own relatives. Sarah Fosdick wouldn't eat her husband, Jay. Mary Ann Graves wouldn't eat her father, Franklin, but they would eat the others. They roasted the flesh over a fire and forced themselves to swallow it, trying not to think about what they were doing, trying to just survive one more day. The two Miwok guides, Salvador and Luis, were horrified. They hadn't signed up for this. They'd been helping these strangers out of kindness, and now they were watching them eat human flesh. The guides took off into the snow, choosing to face death alone rather than stay with this nightmare. The 7 survivors continued on, carrying strips of dried human flesh with them, using it to fuel their desperate trek through the mountains. William Eddy and William Foster went hunting and eventually found and shot Salvador and Luis, who were dying of starvation. The ethics of this are complicated. Were they mercy killings, murders, desperate acts by starving men who maybe were thinking about meat? History doesn't know for sure, and the survivors didn't talk about it clearly. But the forlorn hope kept moving. They followed streams downhill, reasoning that water had to lead eventually to lower elevations. They were more corpses than people at this point, skeletal and frostbitten and probably partially mad. But they kept going. On January 17, 1847, 32 days after leaving the lake camp, the survivors stumbled into a Miwok village on the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada. Of the 15 who'd left the camp, 7 survived, 5 women and 2 men. The women had proven tougher, better able to endure the starvation and cold. The men had mostly died. The Miwok gave them food, carefully because feeding starving people too fast can kill them. Then they helped them reach the nearest white settlement, where the survivors could finally tell the world what was happening back at the lake. The news spread fast. There were people trapped in the mountains, families, children, starving to death. California was still wild country, but the settlements in the Sacramento Valley immediately started organizing rescue parties. But it was the middle of winter. The same storms that had trapped the Donner Party were still raging. Any rescue attempt would have to fight through the same conditions that had nearly killed the Forlorn Hope. It would take time to organize supplies, recruit volunteers, and wait for a break in the weather. Meanwhile, back at the lake, things were getting worse. The people trapped in the camps didn't know that the Forlorn Hope had made it through. For all they knew, everyone who'd left was dead, and they were completely cut off from the world. The food situation had gone from bad to catastrophic. At the lake camp, they'd eaten everything. The oxen hides that made up the roofs of their shelters, they boiled those and ate them. They dug through the snow looking for bones they might have missed, cracking them open to suck out any remaining marrow. People were dying. Bayless Williams, a teamster who'd worked for the Reeds, died in December. Then Milt Elliott, another Reed employee. Then little Harriet McCutcheon, just 1 year old. Her mother, Amanda, had gone with the Forlorn Hope, desperately trying to get help. She'd survived the snowshoe journey, but her baby died while she was gone. The deaths started coming faster. Eleanor Eddy died. Margaret Eddy died. William Eddy was with the Forlorn Hope, and his wife and son died while he was trying to save them. Old Mrs. Murphy, tough as nails, watched her children and grandchildren starving around her. People were too weak to bury the dead properly, so bodies piled up outside in the snow, frozen solid, preserved by the cold. And then someone, probably in late December or early January, the exact date is lost to history because no one was keeping careful records anymore, made a decision, a horrible, necessary, unspeakable decision. They started eating the dead. Not the first to die. Those bodies had been left alone, a last remnant of respect. But as more people died and more people were on the verge of dying, someone cut flesh from a frozen corpse and cooked it, and others ate it, because the alternative was dying themselves. The taboo had been broken back in the mountains by the Forlorn Hope, and now it broke here too. People who never thought they'd be capable of such a thing found themselves eating human flesh to stay alive. Mothers fed it to their children without telling them what it was. Teenagers choked it down and threw it up and forced themselves to eat more. There were rules, unspoken but understood. You didn't eat your own family. You didn't eat anyone while they were alive. They had to be dead first. You didn't talk about it. You just survived. Human psychology is weird about cannibalism. It's this deep taboo, this violation of what it means to be human and civilized. But when you're starving, when your children are dying, when it's either eat or die, the taboo breaks. It has to. And then you have to live with what you did. The Donner family camp, 5 miles away, was in even worse shape. They'd been stuck at their repair site, living in crude tents and lean-tos that weren't as solid as the cabins at the lake. They had less shelter, and they'd run out of food even faster. George Donner had cut his hand badly while making the wagon repairs back in October. The wound had gotten infected, and by December it was seriously bad, probably gangrenous. He was feverish, weak, unable to work or hunt. His brother Jacob was also sick. The leadership of the Donner family group had collapsed. At the Donner camp, they also started eating the dead. There's less documentation of exactly what happened there because fewer people survived to tell the story. But we know people died, and we know the survivors ate them. The anthropological evidence found later at the campsites confirmed it. Bones with cut marks, skulls that had been cracked open to extract brains, long bones split for marrow. The aftermath and the weight of memory. The fourth relief, really more of a salvage operation, went up to the camps in April 1847 after the snow had finally started melting. They found bodies, personal effects, and a landscape of tragedy. They also confirmed through forensic evidence what everyone already knew. Cannibalism had been widespread. Skulls had been split open. Long bones had been broken and boiled. Human remains were mixed with animal remains in cooking pits. The physical evidence was unmistakable, but the survivors would spend the rest of their lives trying to control the narrative about exactly what had happened. Of the roughly 87 people who'd gotten trapped, 48 survived. 39 died, almost half. The survival rate was slightly better for women and children than for men, which is interesting from a physiological standpoint. Women's higher body fat percentage helped them survive starvation longer. Children were prioritized for whatever food existed. Men, who'd often done the heavy labor and used more calories, died faster. The survivors made it to California and had to figure out how to live with what they'd been through. Some of them, like Virginia Reed, were remarkably resilient. Virginia eventually got married, had children, lived to be 87 years old. She wrote an account of the ordeal that became one of our best sources for what happened. Others were broken by it. William Eddy, who'd survived the forlorn hope only to learn that his wife and children had died while he was trying to save them, was never the same. He struggled with survivor's guilt and rage. He got into a gunfight with one of the other survivors over accusations about what had happened in the mountains. Louis Keseberg was accused by many of having murdered Tamsen Donner and others. He sued for libel and won some cases, but the accusations never fully went away. He spent the rest of his life in California, running various businesses, always under the cloud of suspicion. People called him the monster of the mountains. Whether he deserved that reputation or was just a convenient scapegoat for everyone's horror is still debated by historians. The Donner children, those who survived, were scattered among relatives and foster families in California. The 3 youngest Donner girls were taken in by different families and raised separately. They eventually reconnected as adults and shared their fragmented memories of that winter. The survivors had made a pact. They wouldn't talk about the cannibalism in detail. They'd admit it happened because the physical evidence made denial impossible, but they wouldn't say who ate whom or how it was organized or what it was like. That would remain private, a secret shared among those who'd been there. But secrets like that don't stay buried. Journalists tracked down survivors and pestered them for details. Newspapers ran sensational stories about the cannibal party. Books were written. The Donner Party became a legend, a cautionary tale, a horror story told around campfires. In many ways, the sensationalism around the cannibalism overshadowed everything else about the story. People got fixated on the taboo, the gruesome details, the question of who ate whom. They missed the broader tragedy. These were just ordinary people who made one bad decision, taking the Hastings Cutoff, and got catastrophically unlucky with the weather. If they'd reached the pass 2 weeks earlier, they'd have made it over before the snow. If the winter of 1846-47 hadn't been unusually brutal, they might have survived with their supplies. If Lansford Hastings hadn't published his bullshit guidebook promoting a route he'd never tested with wagons, none of this would have happened. The Donner Party wasn't a story of moral failure. It was a story of bad information, bad luck, and the terrible decisions people make when they're desperate. The cannibalism was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was being trapped in the mountains with no food and no way out. But cannibalism is what's stuck in the popular imagination because it's the ultimate taboo. It's what separates humans from animals in our conception of civilization. When you cross that line, even to survive, it marks you forever. The Donner Party survivors knew this. They carried the shame of it alongside the trauma. Some of them tried to reclaim the narrative. Virginia Reed gave interviews and wrote accounts emphasizing the heroism and perseverance rather than the horror. She wanted people to remember that children survived, that families were reunited, that the human spirit could endure incredible hardship. Eliza Donner, one of the 3 youngest Donner girls, wrote a book in 1911 called The Expedition of the Donner Party and Its Tragic Fate. She was 70 years old by then, and she'd spent her whole life living with the knowledge that her parents had died in those mountains, that she'd survived most people couldn't imagine. Her book was an attempt to humanize the victims, to make people see them as individuals rather than as characters in a horror story. And that's maybe the most important thing to remember about the Donner Party. They were individuals. George Donner was 62 years old, a grandfather, a successful farmer who thought he was making a smart choice to get to California faster. Tamsen Donner was an educated woman who chose love over survival.
James Reed was a proud man whose pride led to disaster, but who ultimately saved his family. Virginia Reed was a 13-year-old girl who had to become an adult in the span of 4 months. They weren't monsters. They were people who ended up in an impossible situation and did what they had to do to survive. The fact that what they had to do included eating the dead doesn't make them evil. It makes them human. The location where they were trapped is now a historical site. Donner Memorial Park sits by the lake with a museum and a monument. The monument is 22 feet tall, the height of the snow during that winter. It's hard to stand next to it and imagine being trapped under that much snow, watching it pile up day after day, knowing you can't leave. The museum has artifacts recovered from the campsites: buttons, broken dishes, tools, personal items. There's something deeply sad about seeing a child's toy or a woman's comb and knowing that the person who owned it died in the snow, hungry and cold and far from home. Highway 80 now crosses Donner Pass. Thousands of cars drive over it every day, probably without thinking about what happened there in 1847-48. The pass can still be dangerous in winter. Snow closes the highway regularly, and people still get stuck sometimes. But now we have plows and helicopters and cell phones. Now being stuck just means waiting in your heated car for a few hours until the road reopens. The Donner Party didn't have any of that. They had canvas shelters and oxhide and each other. And when that wasn't enough, they had the bodies of their dead. And they survived, most of them, by crossing a line that civilization says you never cross.
The stories we tell ourselves. Let's talk about Lansford Hastings for a minute, because he's kind of the villain of this story, but he's also absent from most of it. He published his guidebook, promoted his shortcut, and then wasn't there when people followed his advice and died. Hastings survived the 1846 expedition where he led a wagon train through his Cutoff route. He saw firsthand how disastrous it was. The Wasatch Crossing was a nightmare. The salt desert was worse than he'd described. The whole route cost his group enormous time and suffering. And then the Donner Party came behind him and suffered even more. Did Hastings feel guilty? We don't really know. He went on to have a career in California politics and business. He died in 1870 in the Virgin Islands, trying to establish a Confederate colony there after the Civil War, because apparently his ability to make terrible decisions extended to his politics too. But he never, as far as we know, apologized for the guidebook. He never took responsibility for the deaths that resulted from people following his advice. The confidence that let him promote an untested route was apparently strong enough to shield him from guilt. It's very human, honestly. People who cause harm through negligence or hubris often can't acknowledge what they've done because it would break them. So they just move forward, find new projects, convince themselves it wasn't really their fault. The Donner Party died because of bad luck and bad timing, Hastings probably told himself. Not because of bad advice. Never because of the advice. James Reed also had to live with his decisions. He'd been one of the loudest advocates for taking the shortcut. He'd pushed for it when others were unsure. His pride and confidence had been part of what doomed everyone. And then he'd killed a man and gotten exiled, missing the worst of the suffering but also unable to protect his family. Reed survived with his reputation somewhat intact because he'd heroically returned to save everyone. He became a successful businessman in California, made money in the gold rush, and died wealthy in 1874. But you have to wonder what he thought about in private moments. Did he replay that decision at Little Sandy River over and over? Did he see John Snyder's face? Did he hear the screams of the trapped children in his dreams? Virginia Reed, his daughter, always defended her father in her accounts. She loved him and didn't want him blamed for what happened. But even she admitted in her writings that the decision to take the shortcut was a mistake, that they should have stayed with the main wagon train, that her father's pride had led them astray. The psychology of the survivors is fascinating and tragic. They'd been through trauma that most people couldn't comprehend. They'd watched friends and family die. They'd eaten human flesh. They'd made impossible choices about who lived and who died, and then they had to come back to civilization and act normal. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't a recognized condition in 1847. The survivors didn't have therapists or support groups. They just had to carry it alone, or share it only with others who'd been there. Some of them probably developed what we'd now recognize as PTSD, nightmares, flashbacks, hypervigilance, survivor's guilt. The survivors who'd been children when it happened had to grow up with those memories. What's it like to be a 10-year-old who's eaten human flesh? How do you integrate that into your sense of self as you become an adult? The Donner children who survived carried that weight their entire lives. And the question of whether they'd tell their own children what they'd been through, that must have been difficult. Do you burden your kids with that knowledge? Do you risk them seeing you as a monster even though you were just a victim trying to survive? Or do you keep it secret and let them wonder why you sometimes stare out the window with that haunted look? The survivors also had to deal with how other people saw them. In the settlements of California, everyone knew who the Donner Party survivors were. Some people were sympathetic. Others were horrified and kept their distance. There were rumors and accusations. Had anyone been murdered and eaten rather than just eaten after death? Had anyone enjoyed it? Had anyone gone mad? Louis Kesberg bore the brunt of this suspicion. He was accused of killing Tamsin Donner to eat her. He was accused of hoarding food while others starved. He was called a cannibal with a relish that suggested people thought he'd developed a taste for human flesh. He sued multiple people for libel, won some cases, and lost some. Was Kesberg guilty of murder? Probably not. The evidence doesn't really support it. He was alone at the lake camp with multiple bodies. He was one of the last survivors, and he'd clearly been eating the dead for weeks by the time the rescuers found him. But eating the already dead to survive is different from killing to eat. One is survival, the other is murder. The distinction matters. But people needed a monster. They needed someone to blame, someone to embody the horror of what had happened. Kesberg was unpopular, foreign, and had the bad luck to be the last one found alive. So he became the monster. He was the cannibal, the ghoul, the one who'd crossed the line not just from necessity, but from choice. Whether this was fair or not, it destroyed his life. He could never escape the accusations. Even when he won in court, the story persisted. He died in 1995, and his obituary still called him the last survivor of the Donner Party, with heavy implications about what that meant. The other survivors mostly tried to live quietly. They got married, had families, worked normal jobs. They didn't advertise their connection to the Donner Party. Some of them moved and used different names. They wanted to be seen as ordinary people, not as relics of a tragedy. But the story wouldn't let them go. Journalists kept finding them. Historians kept asking questions. Every new generation discovered the Donner Party and wanted to hear from the survivors directly. It must have been exhausting. By the 1870s and 1880s, the Donner Party had become a staple of Western American folklore. It was taught in schools as a cautionary tale. It was referenced in literature. It became shorthand for desperation and cannibalism. Like the Donner Party meant you were facing a situation where normal rules didn't apply. The story got distorted in the retelling. Some accounts exaggerated the cannibalism, suggesting it was more widespread and gleeful than it actually was. Some accounts minimized it, trying to preserve the dignity of the victims. Some accounts straight up invented details that never happened. The truth, as much as we can piece it together from the various survivor accounts and physical evidence, is probably somewhere in the middle. Yes, there was widespread cannibalism, but it happened gradually and with enormous reluctance. No, it probably wasn't organized or systematized. People just did what they had to do when they were literally starving to death. Yes, bodies were butchered and consumed, but they were already dead. The survivors weren't killing each other for food. Probably. There's always that bit of doubt because we'll never know for certain. The survivors who were there took some secrets to their graves. And maybe that's as it should be. Maybe some things don't need to be fully known by history. The bodies in the snow. Let's talk about the physical evidence because it tells its own story. In 1984, a team of archaeologists excavated the Murphy Cabin site at Donner Lake. They found human bones mixed with animal bones in the fire pits and trash middens. They found cut marks on bones consistent with butchery. They found skulls that had been broken open, probably to extract the brains. The bones confirmed what the historical accounts had described: systematic processing of human bodies for food. But the bones also showed something else. The distribution of remains suggested that the bodies had been treated with some respect even in death. They weren't just hacked apart, they'd been carefully disarticulated, suggesting someone with some knowledge of butchery was doing the work carefully. This matters because it suggests the survivors were trying to maintain some humanity even in impossible circumstances. They weren't animals tearing at flesh, they were people trying to survive while holding on to some remnant of civilization. The bones also showed who was eating what. You can tell from isotope analysis in bones what someone's diet was in the months before death. The analysis showed that the adults were eating more of the human flesh than the children. Parents were feeding their kids the less taboo animal parts and taking the human flesh themselves. Even in the depths of survival cannibalism, parents were trying to protect their children's innocence. That detail gets me. These starving people, reduced to eating their dead friends and neighbors, were still trying to shield their children from the full horror of what was happening. They were still parenting, still trying to be moral, still holding on to their humanity by their fingernails. The Murphy cabin site also yielded personal items: buttons, beads, bits of fabric, broken dishes. The everyday detritus of families trying to survive. A child's doll, its face worn smooth by loving hands, found in the ruins of a cabin where children starved. A man's razor, still sharp, found near bones that suggested someone had kept shaving even as they were dying. These items humanize the story in ways that the dramatic accounts can't. The Donner Party wasn't just a horror story. It was people trying to maintain normalcy in the face of disaster. They were still getting dressed in the morning, still washing dishes, still playing with toys, still shaving, right up until they couldn't anymore. The Donner family campsite was excavated in the 1990s. The remains there told a grimmer story. More bones, more evidence of cannibalism, and signs that the camp had descended into chaos in the final weeks. Bodies weren't buried properly. Remains were scattered. The camp looked like it had been abandoned in a panic, which makes sense if the people there were dying faster than the survivors could process. And notably, no bones that could definitively be identified as Tamsin Donner's. Her fate remains a mystery, one of the many small tragedies within the larger tragedy. The archaeological evidence also helped settle some historical debates. For instance, there had been claims that some of the party had engaged in murder cannibalism, killing people to eat them rather than just eating the already dead. The bone evidence doesn't support this. The bodies showed signs of death from starvation and cold, not from violence. The cut marks were post-mortem, made after death. This doesn't prove that no one was murdered, but it makes it less likely. If people were being killed for food, you'd expect to see trauma on some of the bones, blunt force injuries, knife wounds, something. The absence of such evidence suggests that most of the cannibalism was survival cannibalism of the already dead, not murder. Louis Keseberg, take note. The archaeology kind of backs up your story. But evidence can only tell us so much. The emotional reality of what the survivors went through, the psychological weight of their choices, the way it shaped the rest of their lives, that's only preserved in stories they told and the stories they didn't tell. Virginia Reed wrote in one of her accounts, "Don't take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can." It's become one of the most famous quotes from the Donner Party, a piece of practical advice that's also a summary of how the disaster could have been avoided. If they'd stuck to the established route and moved quickly, they'd have been fine. But there's more to her quote, the part that's less often remembered. Remember, never take no cutoffs and hurry along as fast as you can. Thank God we have all got through and the only family that did not eat human flesh. She was proud that the Reed family, according to her account, didn't participate in the cannibalism. Whether this was true is debatable. The Reed family was separated. James was exiled, the rest were at the lake camp and then rescued in stages. Virginia was 13 and may not have known everything that happened.
Or she may have been protecting her family's reputation by claiming they abstained from what almost everyone else was doing. The claim also raises uncomfortable questions. If the Reeds didn't eat human flesh, did they eat something else? Were they less hungry than the others? Did someone else feed them, sacrifice their own portions so the Reed children wouldn't have to cross that line? Was Virginia's claim an innocent belief or a careful lie? We'll never know, and maybe it doesn't matter. Whether the Reeds ate human flesh or not doesn't change the tragedy. It doesn't make them better or worse than the others. It just makes them survivors with a story to tell and a reputation to protect.
The mythology and the memory. The Donner Party story has been adapted and retold countless times since 1847. There have been books, movies, TV shows, folk songs, and academic papers. Every generation rediscovers the story and finds new meaning in it. In the 19th century, it was told as a cautionary tale about the dangers of westward expansion and the importance of following established wisdom. Don't take shortcuts. Don't trust newfangled guidebooks. Stick to what's proven. In the 20th century, it became a story about American resilience and survival. Look at what our ancestors endured. Look at how they survived impossible odds. The cannibalism was downplayed or euphorized, they ate what they had to eat, in favor of focusing on the heroism of the rescuers and the strength of the survivors. In the 21st century, we've gotten more comfortable discussing the psychological aspects. What does it do to a person to eat human flesh? How do you live with that? What does it say about human nature that we're capable of both terrible things and tremendous compassion in the same moments? The story has also been used metaphorically. We're in a Donner Party situation, means you're trapped with limited resources and facing impossible choices. The phrase has been used in business contexts, military contexts, political contexts. It's become divorced from the actual historical event and turned into a symbol. This bothers some historians because it flattens the real people involved into archetypes. The Donner Party survivors weren't metaphors. They were Virginia Reed and Patty Reed and young Francis Donner and all the others who lived through hell and came out changed. But that's how memory works. Events become stories, stories become legends, legends become myths, myths become symbols. The actual details blur, and what remains is the emotional core. Desperation, survival, the breakdown of taboos, the question of what we're capable of when pushed to our limits. The site where it happened has become something like a pilgrimage destination. People visit Donner Memorial State Park and stand by the lake, looking up at the pass, trying to imagine what it was like. Some people feel a connection to the tragedy. Others just think it's a cool historical footnote. Some people are ghoulishly interested in the cannibalism. Others focus on the survival story. The monument at the park lists the names of everyone who was part of the Donner Party, both survivors and victims. It's oddly democratic. Everyone gets listed no matter how they died or what they did to survive. George Donner and Tamsin Donner are there. James Reed is there. Louis Kessberg is there. The children who died are there next to the children who survived. Reading those names, you realize how many children were involved. Babies, toddlers, young kids, teenagers. More than half the party was under 18. They were families, not just pioneers or adventurers. Families who wanted a better life and instead found the worst winter of their lives. Some of the survivors went on to successful lives and tried to bury their past. Others were broken by what they had experienced and never recovered. A few became advocates, telling their story publicly in hopes that it would help others avoid similar fates. Eliza Donner Houghton, the youngest of the Donner girls to survive, spent much of her later life answering questions and giving interviews about the ordeal. She was 3 years old when it happened, so her memories were fragmentary and probably mixed with stories she'd been told. But she felt a responsibility to keep the memory of her parents alive and to humanize the victims. In her book, she wrote about her mother Tamsin with obvious love and pain.
She described a woman who was educated, artistic, and deeply devoted to her family. Tamsin had brought books and watercolors with her on the journey west, evidence that she saw the trip as an adventure and not just drudgery. She'd wanted to see new places, paint new landscapes, maybe start a school in California. Instead, she died in the snow, circumstances unknown, after watching her husband die and sending her children away with strangers. The waste of it, the sheer tragedy of potential cut short, haunted Eliza for her entire life. The Donner Party story also raises uncomfortable questions about cannibalism that society still struggles to answer. Is survival cannibalism morally acceptable? Most people say yes intellectually. If you're starving and the person is already dead, eating them to survive is understandable. But emotionally, we still recoil from it. We still treat it as taboo and see people who've done it as contaminated somehow. The Donner Party survivors faced this prejudice. They'd done nothing wrong except survive, but they were marked by what they'd had to do. Some of them internalized that shame and saw themselves as tainted. Others rejected it and insisted they'd done what anyone would do in the same situation. There's an interesting gender dimension too. The women who survived the Forlorn Hope, Sarah Foster, Harriet Pike, Marianne Graves, Sarah Fosdick, and Amanda McCutcheon, were praised for their strength and endurance, but they were also the ones who'd participated in cannibalism on that journey. Society could hold both thoughts at once. These women were heroes, and they ate human flesh. The men who survived were treated more harshly, especially Louis Kessberg. Maybe it's because we expect women to be more civilized, more moral, so when they do something taboo, it's easier to be forgiven as desperation. Or maybe it's because the women had children depending on them, so their survival was seen as necessary for the kids. Or maybe it's just sexism. Women are judged less harshly for everything, including cannibalism, because society has lower expectations. Whatever the reason, the female survivors generally had an easier time reintegrating into society than the male survivors. They got married, had families, and lived relatively normal lives. The men struggled more with accusations and suspicion. The children who survived had their own unique burden. They grew up knowing they'd been through something that most adults couldn't handle. Some of them, like Virginia Reed, seemed to thrive on that. They were survivors, marked by tragedy but not destroyed by it. Others were more fragile, more haunted. And all of them had to decide whether to tell their own children what they had experienced. Some did, passing down the story as family history. Others kept silent, letting the past stay buried. A few wrote accounts when they were old, finally ready to talk about it after decades of silence. What it means to survive. The Donner Party raises fundamental questions about survival and morality. Is it wrong to eat human flesh if the person is already dead and you'll die without it? Most ethical frameworks say no, it's not wrong. The person is dead, they don't need their body anymore, and your life has value that's worth preserving. But most ethical frameworks also weren't created by people who'd actually faced that choice. It's easy to say survival cannibalism is acceptable when you're sitting in a comfortable chair with a full stomach. It's different when you're looking at the frozen body of someone you knew, someone you talked to yesterday, someone whose children are watching you cut meat from their corpse. The Donner Party survivors talked about how the first time was the hardest, how they had to force themselves to eat, how some people threw up immediately, how others cried while they chewed. But then it got easier. Not easy, never easy, but easier. The body learns that this is food, this is calories, this is survival. The mind still recoils, but the body takes over. That's disturbing in its own way. We like to think our moral sense would prevent us from doing things we consider wrong, but survival instinct is stronger than morality. When you're literally starving to death, your body will override your ethics. You'll eat things you never thought you'd eat. You'll do things you never thought you'd do. And then you have to live with it afterward. Some of the Donner Party survivors seemed to process this by focusing on the fact that they didn't kill anyone. They ate the dead, but they didn't create the dead. That distinction mattered to them. They weren't murderers, they were just survivors who made hard choices. Others seemed to process it by minimizing their own participation. In their accounts, they ate very little human flesh, or they only ate it once or twice, or they didn't eat it at all. Whether these claims were true or face-saving lies, they show the psychological need to distance oneself from the act. Still others embraced it with a kind of dark pride. Yes, they ate human flesh. Yes, they survived. They did what they had to do and they weren't ashamed. This attitude was less common, probably because it invited social condemnation, but you can see hints of it in some accounts. Louis Keseberg, for instance, was accused of not just eating human flesh, but of having enjoyed it, of having preferred it to other food. This accusation is almost certainly false. Keseberg was starving and eating whatever was available, but the fact that people made this accusation shows their need to see him as fundamentally different, as someone whose survival cannibalism crossed a line into something more sinister. The truth is probably that no one enjoyed it, but some people were better at compartmentalizing, at separating the act of eating from the knowledge of what they were eating. Those people survived more easily, both physically and psychologically. The people who couldn't compartmentalize, who thought too much about what they were doing, probably had a harder time surviving. Which raises another uncomfortable question. Is the ability to commit taboo acts without excessive guilt a survival advantage? And if so, what does that say about human evolution and morality? The Donner Party also demonstrates how quickly social structures break down under stress. In the beginning, they had leaders and rules and group cohesion. By the end, they were scattered in separate camps, barely communicating, each family or individual focused solely on their own survival. The strong ate first, the weak got less. Children were prioritized, but not always. Some parents were too far gone to care. The sick were left to die because taking care of them used resources that the healthy needed to survive. It was brutal and Darwinian, and very far from the idealized image of frontier families helping each other. But even in that breakdown, there were moments of grace. Tamsin Donner staying with her dying husband, the women who went with the forlorn hope knowing they probably wouldn't make it, the rescuers who risked their lives multiple times to save strangers, the parents who gave their children the last scraps of food. Humans are complicated. We're capable of both terrible selfishness and incredible sacrifice, often within the same person in the same situation. The Donner Party survivors contained multitudes. They ate human flesh, and they saved children, and they shared what little they had, and they let people die when sharing would have killed everyone. There's no simple moral to this story. It's not people are good or people are bad. It's people are people, and under extreme stress, they do what they have to do to survive. And sometimes that's beautiful, and sometimes that's horrifying, and usually it's both. Louis Reed, in her later accounts, tried to emphasize the positives. She talked about how families stayed together, how people helped each other, how even in the worst moments there was kindness. She wanted people to remember the Donner Party as a story of survival and resilience, not just as a horror story about cannibalism. And she's not wrong. They did survive, most of them. They endured months of starvation and cold that should have killed everyone. They made it through and went on to live full lives. That's remarkable. That's worth celebrating. But you can't separate the survival from the horror. The resilience and the cannibalism are two sides of the same coin. They survived because they were willing to cross lines that most people never have to think about crossing. That's not a feel-good story. That's a human story in all its messy complexity.
The endless winter finally ends. As spring arrived in the Sierra Nevada in 1847, the snow finally began to melt. The passes opened. The landscape that had been a prison for months became traversable again. But by then, everyone who could leave had left. The only things remaining at the camps were bodies, ruins, and memories. The final salvage parties retrieved what personal effects they could find and gave them to survivors or families of the dead.
They buried or burned the remaining human remains, trying to give some dignity to the dead even though it was far too late. Local Miwok and Washoe people knew about the camps and what had happened there. The story entered their oral traditions, the winter when the white settlers got trapped and ate each other. It became a cautionary tale in their communities, too, a reminder of the arrogance of people who thought they could cross the mountains in winter without proper knowledge. The survivors dispersed into California, trying to build new lives. Some of them succeeded admirably. James Reed became wealthy and respected in San Jose. Several of the children grew up, married, had families, and lived to old age. They became teachers, farmers, business people, ordinary citizens with extraordinary pasts. Others struggled. Marriages fell apart. Mental health declined. Some survivors drank heavily, probably self-medicating what we'd now recognize as PTSD. Some moved frequently, never putting down roots, always restless. The trauma followed them. The Donner name became infamous. For decades, being a Donner in California meant constant questions and assumptions. The three youngest Donner girls all eventually married and took their husbands' names, probably partly to escape the association. But they never really could escape. People always found out eventually. In the 1850s, during the California Gold Rush, thousands more people crossed the Sierra Nevada. Many of them passed by the Donner Lake site and stopped to look at the ruins. Some people took souvenirs, bones mostly, which is deeply disturbing but not surprising. The camps became a morbid tourist attraction before anyone even thought to preserve them properly. By the 1860s, the Transcontinental Railroad was being planned, and it would cross the Sierra Nevada right through Donner Pass. The same pass that had been impassable for the Donner Party would soon have trains running through it year-round. Technology and infrastructure would conquer what had killed 39 people just 20 years earlier. The survivors aged. They had grandchildren. They became living connections to an increasingly distant past. Journalists would track them down periodically for anniversary articles, 50 years since the Donner Party and such. The survivors would give interviews, always careful about what they said, always aware that the wrong word could bring back all the old accusations and suspicions. Virginia Reed died in 1921 at age 87. She'd outlived almost everyone else from the party. In her final years, she was still giving interviews, still telling the story, still trying to control the narrative. She wanted to be remembered as a survivor, not a victim, as someone strong, not someone pitiable, as someone who'd been through hell and come out the other side with grace. Eliza Donner Houghton died in 1922, also in her 80s. She'd spent decades advocating for the memory of her parents and trying to correct what she saw as misrepresentations of the story. Her book was one of the most thorough accounts from a survivor's perspective, and it humanized the victims in ways that earlier sensational accounts hadn't. Louis Kieseberg had died in 1995, still maintaining his innocence of the murder charges, still insisting he'd only done what anyone would do to survive. Whether people believed him or not, his story highlights how the accusation of improper behavior during the disaster could haunt someone for life. By the mid-20th century, all the survivors were dead. The Donner Party had transitioned from living memory to history. But the story didn't die. If anything, it grew stronger. Books continued to be published. Historians continued to debate what had happened and what it meant. The site continued to draw visitors. In the 1960s and 70s, there was a renewed academic interest in the Donner Party from anthropological and archaeological perspectives. Researchers wanted to understand the physical reality of what the survivors had endured. How many calories does a starving person need to survive? How does the body process protein from human flesh versus animal flesh? What were the actual conditions in the camps? This research was macabre but valuable.
It helped establish that the survivors weren't exaggerating when they described their suffering. A person can't survive for months on the rations the Donner Party had available without supplementing from other sources. The cannibalism wasn't a choice or a moral failing. It was genuinely necessary for survival. The excavations in the 1980s and 90s provided physical confirmation. The bones told the story that the survivors were reluctant to tell in full. Yes, there was systematic cannibalism. Yes, it was widespread. No, it probably wasn't murder, just survival. Modern retellings of the Donner Party story tend to be more sympathetic than the 19th century versions. We understand trauma better now. We understand survival psychology. We're less likely to judge the survivors for doing what they had to do. But we're still fascinated, still drawn to the story, still trying to understand it.
What we can learn from the snow. So what is the Donner Party story really about? It's tempting to find a simple moral. Don't take shortcuts. Don't trust unreliable information. Don't attempt difficult journeys without adequate preparation. And all of those are true as far as they go. But the deeper meaning is about human nature under stress, about how civilization is a thin veneer that can be stripped away by hunger and cold, about how people make impossible choices and then have to live with them, about how survival requires compromises that we like to think we'd never make. The Donner Party survivors proved that humans are capable of adapting to almost anything. They survived conditions that should have killed them. They crossed moral lines that most people never imagined crossing. They endured trauma that broke some of them, but that others somehow integrated and moved past. We want to know, would we have survived? Would we have made the same choices? Would we have eaten human flesh to save our children, ourselves? And we can't really know until we're in that situation, which hopefully we never will be. The story also raises questions about leadership and decision-making under uncertainty. The Donner Party wasn't doomed by one bad decision. It was doomed by a series of decisions, each one reasonable at the time, that compounded into disaster. Taking the shortcut seemed smart. Stopping for repairs seemed necessary. Trying to cross the pass one more time seemed possible. Each choice made sense in the moment, but together they created catastrophe. That's more frightening in some ways than a single catastrophic mistake, because it means you can make all reasonable choices and still end up in hell. You can do your best and still fail. You can be smart and careful and prudent and lucky right up until you're not. The Donner Party also demonstrates the power of narrative. The survivors told their stories, and those stories shaped how everyone understood what happened. Virginia Reed's version emphasized resilience. Keseberg's version emphasized survival necessity. The journalists' versions emphasized horror. And all of these versions were true, and none of them were complete. History is written by the survivors, literally. The people who died in the snow don't get to tell their version. We don't know what Tamsin Donner was thinking in her final days. We don't know how the children processed what was happening around them. We don't know the interior experiences of the people who died early or late or in between. We only know what the survivors chose to tell us. And they chose carefully, because they had to live with their choices and their reputations and the judgments of others for the rest of their lives. Modern media has kept the Donner Party relevant. There have been multiple films, including a 2009 documentary and various dramatic recreations. There have been novels, including historical fiction that imagines the interior lives of the survivors. There have been podcasts, because of course there have been podcasts. The story keeps getting retold because it touches something primal in us. The fear of being trapped, the fear of starvation, the fear of crossing moral boundaries, the fear of becoming someone you don't recognize. These are universal human fears, and the Donner Party story embodies all of them. But there's also fascination with resilience, with people who endured the unendurable, with mothers who kept their children alive, with teenagers who became adults overnight, with ordinary people who did extraordinary things. That's part of the appeal too. The monument at Donner Memorial State Park has an inscription that reads, "Virile to risk and find, kindly withal and a ready help. facing the brunt of fate, indomitable, unafraid. It's Victorian prose, flowery and formal, but it captures something true about how we want to remember the Donner Party, as pioneers and survivors, not as cannibals and victims. And maybe they were both. Maybe that's the point. You can be indomitable and afraid. You can be kind and desperate. You can be human and do inhuman things to survive. The Donner Party doesn't fit into neat moral categories, and that's why we're still talking about it almost 180 years later. The physical landscape where it happened is beautiful now. Donner Lake is a popular recreation area. People swim there in summer, ski nearby in winter. The pass is crossed by thousands of cars every day. The forest has grown back. Nature doesn't remember trauma. Only humans do that. But if you visit the site and know the history, it changes how you see the landscape. Those beautiful pine trees witnessed people dying. That serene lake was surrounded by desperate shelters. Those gentle slopes were impassable walls of snow. The beauty becomes haunted, which is maybe appropriate. Some places should be haunted. Some stories should make us uncomfortable. The Donner Party isn't a feel-good tale, and it shouldn't be turned into one. It's a tragedy that happened to real people who suffered real horror. Honoring them means acknowledging the full truth of what they went through, not sanitizing it or sensationalizing it. The children who survived grew up to be adults who had to explain to their own children where they came from. Imagine that conversation. Well, kids, when Mommy was 7 years old, she got trapped in the mountains and ate people to survive. How do you even begin to approach that? Some of them didn't. Some of the survivors never told their children the full story. They said they'd been part of a pioneer party that got trapped, and people died, and it was very hard. But they didn't mention the cannibalism. They let their kids find out from history books or from cruel classmates who'd heard the stories. That must have been its own kind of trauma, having your parents' history exposed by outsiders rather than explained by them. Learning that your mother or father had eaten human flesh not from them, but from some sensational newspaper article. The betrayal of the secret, even though keeping the secret was probably meant to protect.
The final word that never comes. There's no tidy conclusion to the Donner Party story. The survivors didn't all reconcile or heal or find peace. They just lived, carried their trauma, and eventually died, leaving behind accounts and artifacts and questions. The historical record is frustratingly incomplete. We don't know exactly who ate what or when, or how people made those decisions. We don't know the emotional toll with any precision. We can infer and guess and imagine, but we can't know. What we do know is that 87 people headed into the mountains in October 1846, and 48 came out. 39 died, men, women, and children, who just wanted to go to California and start new lives. They didn't deserve what happened to them. No one deserves that. The survivors carried guilt, survivor's guilt, the guilt of hard choices, the guilt of taboo breaking. Some of them seemed to process it well, others were haunted forever. All of them were changed. You don't go through something like that and come out the same person you were before. And the rest of us, safely removed by time and distance and full stomachs, get to wonder, what would we have done? And be grateful we'll probably never have to find out. The Donner Party story has been used to justify all sorts of things over the years. It's been used to argue against immigration. Look what happens when you trust outsiders with bad information. It's been used to argue for better infrastructure. We need railroads so this never happens again. It's been used to argue about human nature. We're either fundamentally good, and these people were exceptions, or fundamentally selfish, and these people were normal. But maybe it doesn't need to argue anything. Maybe it's just a story about what happened when everything went wrong and people tried their best and mostly failed, and some of them survived anyway. Not every historical event needs to be a moral lesson. Sometimes bad things just happen to people who don't deserve it. The names of the dead are worth remembering. Bayless Williams, John Snyder, Hardcoop, James Smith, Joseph Reinhardt, Charles Berger, and so many others. The children, Harriet McCutcheon, Catherine Pike, Naomi Pike,
Louis Donner Jr., Isaac Donner. The adults, George Donner, Tamsin Donner, Jacob Donner, Eleanor Eddy. They died in the snow, hungry and cold and far from home. Their bodies were eaten by their friends and families, not from malice, but from desperate necessity. And then they were mostly forgotten, overshadowed by the survivors who got to tell the story. But they matter too. Every person who died mattered. Every child who starved mattered. Every parent who watched their kids suffer mattered. The tragedy isn't just that people ate human flesh. The tragedy is that people died who should have lived. The survivors tried to honor the dead by surviving, by living full lives, by not letting the tragedy define everything. Some succeeded better than others, but all of them carried the dead with them, in memories, in nightmares, in the story they had to tell over and over. And now we carry the story too, passed down through almost 2 centuries, still powerful, still disturbing, still deeply human in its awfulness and its resilience. If there's anything to learn from the Donner Party, maybe it's this. Listen to good advice. Don't trust con men with guidebooks. Take care of each other when things go wrong, and hope you never have to make the choices they made. Also, maybe don't name your road trip after your family. It tempts fate. The snow in the Sierra Nevada still falls every winter, sometimes 20 feet deep or more. The pass is still there. Donner Lake is still there. The landscape remembers nothing, but we remember for it. 87 people tried to cross the mountains. 39 died. 48 survived. All of them were changed. And their story became one of the most famous disasters in American history, told and retold, analyzed and sensationalized, honored and exploited. The real story, the complete truth of what those months were like for the people living through them, is lost. We have fragments, accounts written years later, physical evidence, and lots of speculation. We can piece together the facts, but not the feelings. We can know what they did, but not fully understand why or how it felt. And maybe that's okay. Maybe some experiences are too extreme to fully communicate. Maybe the survivors were right to keep some things private, to protect themselves and their loved ones from the full weight of what they'd endured. The Donner Party happened. People suffered and died and survived. The snow eventually melted. Life continued. The story was told. And here we are, still thinking about it, still trying to understand it, still wondering what we would have done in their place. That's where we'll leave it tonight, with that question hanging in the air, with the snow falling in the Sierra Nevada, covering everything, making the world clean and white and silent. With the knowledge that underneath the snow there's history and tragedy and the messy, complicated reality of human survival. Sleep well and be grateful you're not trapped in the mountains with winter closing in and the food running out. Good night.